In this first of group of Rick Talks or lectures, if you'd like, I want to talk about some basic concepts and important terminology for all computer use, but especially with graphics. The first thing that we want to talk about and look at is the fact that it's very important that we remember that our computers, our computers only have zeros and ones inside of them. They are, in fact, in my opinion, just super calculators. There are no color images. There are no images of any kind. Everything is captured in zeros and ones. The next term that we want to talk about is thankfully when folks and computers started their current trek, folks agreed upon a universal language or code of zeros and ones so that it didn't change, I guess, from country to country. And it's called the ASCII Universal Code. That stands for American Standard Code for Information Interchange, better known as ASCII. And thankfully, that keeps things a little bit simpler than they could be with our computers universally. The next thing that we want to talk about is the basic concept that when, in fact, we type letters and words inside the computer, each letter, each character, in other words, letter or character, and punctuation is registered as a series of eight of those little zeros and ones, a little group of 8 zeros and ones, and in different order and different amounts of the ones and the zeros combine to allow us to do all of the characters and numbers and punctuation that we typically use when we are typing text or copy in our computers. And every one of those individual zeros and ones, doesn't matter which, is one bit of information. And when we type an A or a B or a C, and it registers as the specific little group of 8 of those zeros and ones, that's called a byte. So the little groupings of 8 zeros and ones together for each of the letters and punctuation and numbers is a byte. And the individual pieces, parts, are bits. Now, when we start talking about graphic images, it's important to remember that there's no specific group of zeros and ones that make up a picture of a cow or a horse or a house or anything else. And so we need to build it from the ground up. And there are basically two general kinds of graphic software programs. And vector art, as demonstrated by Adobe Illustrator, and pixel-based art, as most people know of as Photoshop type art. Those are the two fundamental different software programs. Of course, there are other software programs out there that some folks use, but we're talking about on the professional level, and specifically these days that has been simplified a little bit because it's primarily the Adobe suite, the Adobe CS, a creative suite of programs that includes Illustrator and Photoshop that are our primary professional level graphic programs. So when we talk about vector art is described as mathematical formulas to describe the shapes and the outlines. Apparently, as I understand it, vector, when you go from one place to another, it's an aeronautical term, going from one place to another, and that is a vector. And that is typical of how Illustrator and vector art works. You do the anchor points, and then they're connected by a line or a vector. Then we have pixel-based art, and that includes anything that we capture in our digital camera, anything that we capture by scanning, and anything that we create or manipulate in Photoshop. We consider all of that to be pretty much the same. And in its simplest form, if I gave you a little stack of black and white little 1-inch pieces of tile, kind of like you see in an old-fashioned bathroom, and I said, make a picture by putting them together in a grid form. It might not be very detailed, etc., but you could more or less put together a crude basic image. And that is a really good analogy for how pixel-based art works in its simplest form, like those old bathroom tile, to create images one little block at a time. Some other terms. We have a term in the industry that is in the lingo that's called a RIP. And that is an acronym for Raster Image Processor. And the lingo often says we are ripping a file. And it's very important because a raster image processor is an electronic component that we have in all laser printers, and any printing or output device at a professional print shop, and many of our high-end inkjet printers have a raster image processor, an electronic device. Not so for vast majority of the low-end, inexpensive inkjet printers that many of us have at home. Whether it's the mathematical formulas of vectors, or whether it's the pixels of Photoshop type art, in printing, all of that information needs to be converted to type patterns of dots. And that conversion of the vectors and the pixels to those dot patterns so that it can be printed is the ripping process. So it's the conversion to dot patterns that is raster image processing. And another important term that in the early days of the Adobe folks and the Macs, and it's one of the important reasons why Mac computers got off to a head start in the industry. Together they created a language, a programming language called PostScript. It's fundamental to desktop publishing and all of the sophisticated computing that we all do with images and even web pages, etc. And you'll hear the word PostScript used a number of times and places. It's fundamental. It was probably never meant to be as sophisticated and create such complex technology, but it has, and the Adobe folks have done a good job of having it rise to the occasion as it's become more refined over time. All right, another term, square function of resolution. We talk an awful lot about resolution in various ways. And for instance, in the case of printing, we talk about dots per inch. And an important part of that is that resolution is a square function, which dramatically changes what our first perception might be. Now, of course, I think most of us are familiar with terms. When we talk about the size of a building, we talk about square feet. If we talk about buying some carpeting, we may talk about square feet, or we might talk about square yards. Well, in printing and in desktop publishing, we talk about how many units are in a square inch. So it's always dots per inch, pixels per inch. And it's important, again, the main point here is that if we say, for instance, 300 dots per inch, it's not 300 dots per inch. It's 300 vertically, 300 horizontally. And 300 times 300 is in fact 90,000. Dramatically higher number. And that in fact, in each square inch of an area of printed or created imagery, if it's 300 dots per inch, then in fact we actually have 90,000 little pieces of information that for every square inch of that document that needs to be processed and crunched and printed. And I always tell my students, you know, it's really quite amazing that this business ever works. Okay? Now, let's keep moving here. I got a couple of characteristics of the two basic kinds of graphic software. Again, I've already mentioned Illustrator is typical of vector art. Photoshop and scanning and capturing in our digital cameras is typical of pixel-based art. And so what I have here are some general characteristics. These aren't set in stone, but I think that they help to explain and differentiate the two. Now, it's not important that you know in what order I have these characteristics. What is important is that you know which characteristics go with which kind of art. Okay, and also, since I'm more or less comparing, I did put the what I consider a kind of an equivalent characteristic in the same place for each of the two kinds. Meaning, for instance, the first one, vector for Illustrator art, raster for Photoshop type art. So, but otherwise, you just need to know in general which ones go with which kind of art. So, Illustrator, vector art. Obviously, I've been talking about it being a vector software program, and so that's why that term applies. As some of you know, and you certainly will learn if you work with Illustrator, that every little piece of an Illustrator file is an outlined little object, no matter how large or small. And so, therefore, we say it's an outline software program. Also, because every single little piece's part is its own a little object, we can say it's an object-oriented software program. Because we generally are not manipulating photographs, but are creating artistic, illustrative type images, we would then say it's a drawing program. And we're going to be talking quite a bit with in future PowerPoints and lectures and Rick Talks. The file format that is most often attributed with Illustrator is EPS. EPS. Encapsulated PostScript. There's that term, PostScript again. And then let's keep moving. Very important. We're going to be talking quite a bit about this. Illustrator, vector art, is resolution independent. Resolution independent. And that is very important. And I always tell my students, only amateurs create things like logo designs in Photoshop. Why? And it has to do with this term, resolution independent. Illustrator art can be made as big or as small as you want, as many times as you want, and it will always print crisp and clean because it's resolution independent. Simply what happens is the computer recalculates the shapes and the curves, the mathematical formulas once again, and for outputting. Okay, that's very different, as we'll talk about here, with Photoshop type art. So, Photoshop type art is raster. Now, I mentioned a few minutes ago that everything is rasterized, whether it's Illustrator or Photoshop images, so converted to dots, rasterizing, so it can be printed. But in particular, Photoshop is referred to as a raster software program. And bitmapped instead of outlined, bitmapped because it's all images are mapped out on a grid, if you will, and each little pixel is a 0 or a 1 and is a bit of information. So it's bit mapped, and that's how we get there. Of course, we're typically working with photographic type images, so we'll say it's an image editing program. Also, because there are many more traditional painting and drawing type tools in Photoshop than really Illustrator, where you're manipulating anchor points and the curves, etc. We will say it's a painting program. Okay, a painting program. And then the file format that's most often um, attributed with Photoshop art is TIFF, Tag Information File Format. And in EPS with Illustrator and TIFF for Photoshop type art are the only two high resolution file formats. Now, many of you already know that we use many other file formats, JPEG, GIF, PNGs, etc., for web pages and multimedia, because those are low resolution file formats. But for printing purposes, the only two file formats that are high resolution are EPS and TIFF. Okay, unquestionable. Then the last point that I had addressed with Illustrator is Photoshop is resolution dependent. Resolution dependent. And the bottom line is that, as be clearly explained in some of the later talks, is that when you mess with the size of an image, whether it's in Photoshop or outside of Photoshop, if you place one in InDesign or Illustrator and you change the size of it, you are messing with the resolution. And the size and the resolution are tied together in a corresponding relationship. Always. You make an image bigger, you lower the resolution. You make an image smaller, you increase the resolution. So that's why, going back to this concept of logos, for instance, one day I need a logo design that is an inch across for a business card, and then the next day I may need it 10 feet tall to be put on the side of a building or the side of a vehicle. And Illustrator art does that and is always crisp and clean. The other important point is that many of the standard signs that are created are done on vinyl cutters. Basically, a big plotter with a blade, and it cuts out the letters and the images, and it's kind of like the sticky paper folks put on shells, but it can then be applied to a board or a side of a building or a side of a vehicle. And the bottom line is that that kind of art is only read, the machines that is, can only read vector art because they read the outlines of all the pieces parts. And if you send a sign shop a piece of pixel-based art, they're kind of dead in the water because their machines cannot read the pixels. They need Illustrator type vector art to read the outlines, cut the letters and or the images so that they can be then applied to other surfaces. So very, very fundamental, important difference for sure between Illustrator and Photoshop.